Hello everyone, welcome to this video. We're going to explore postmodernism today, and that will take us a bit into deconstruction, and we're going to look at postmodern treatments of memory, in particular in the story The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges. And this takes us beyond the limbic system in so many ways. I think if we're trying to sort of describe what postmodernism is about, at least in our field, I would say that its focuses on language and on the fundamental role of language in the formation of subject identity. And by that I mean, of course, our notion of what it is to be a human being. And in that sense, I think postmodernism flows from the language-based philosophy of the likes of Mikhail Bakhtin, Russian, who died in 1975, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Austrian, who died in 1951. There are others too, of course. But the basic idea here that these language-based philosophers have is that we understand ourselves, our subject identity, and the world around us by using concepts. And the currency of those concepts is language. So that whereas people or philosophers prior to the 20th century more or less thought of language as a neutral thing, something like a window you just see through and, describe the world, I think that, by the time you get to the 20th century, and these philosophers, they seem to be saying sometimes that the window is the only thing we've got. I refer you back to the example, Wittgenstein's example that I mentioned, I think in the previous video, the one where you go to a doctor, right? And in order for the diagnosis to commence, you have to reach for, well, not just language, you have to reach for a language trope, a metaphor or a simile to describe your pain. So it is that you don't actually feel anything without finding the similes or metaphors that will put that feeling into words, whether you are feeling like $1 million right now sitting in front of your computer, or more likely feeling like shit, okay? You need the metaphors to get you there. On perhaps something of a tangent, this is why grammar is so important. This is why vocabulary is so important. This is what I say to my English 100 students who sometimes seem to think that grammar is some, toxic residue of colonialism that we're just forcing on people. Well, actually, it doesn't matter what language you're using. The better you use it, the broader your vocabulary, the more precise and concise you are and articulate you are, the better you will understand yourself and the world around you, and the better you will be able to navigate that world. It's fundamentally important to us in that sense. Okay, so what many postmodern theorists do, certainly in the field of humanities and literature, is tease away and expose the radical uncertainties and instabilities of metaphors and similes, or shall we just say the signifying chain, that we so depend upon. This, for example, is the project of deconstruction, which you may have heard of. It's a literary perspective, most associated, I think, with the French theorist Jacques Derrida, who, in his essays, is exploring this supplementarity of meanings, so that you can have a reading that it seems the author intended, and it's just going to spin off in all sorts of contradictory ways. And it can be quite fun. I do deconstruction, I suppose, in all my classes. Well, pretty much everything I teach, I am, in a sense, deconstructing it, and just exploring with students the myriad ways in which we can read the same text. I think I mentioned this to you in the first video I did in this course. So let's think about a course outline and some monologic authoritarian statement that you will be very familiar with, which says something like students have to attend 80% of all classes in order to pass the course. Okay, that seems clear enough, doesn't it? No argument there. All right, so imagine that I'm the instructor and I go into class every week and I never see Fred, hardly ever. And suddenly there's Fred doing the final exam. And I go up to Fred and I say to him or her, what's up? Didn't you read the course outline? Where have you been? And Fred says to me, oh, I thought that was a challenge. Oh, no, I want to prove to you that I can pass this course and do it really well without attending any of the classes. Don't get any ideas, by the way. Or then there's this fabulous notice that one sees occasionally, or iterations of it, next to an elevator, which says something like, seeing eye dogs only. Now, if you're a deconstructionist, this is just manna from heaven. I mean, you just play with this, don't you? Seeing eye dogs only. So that means if my dog is blind, it's going to have to walk the stairs. Huh? Or does this actually mean that everyone has to walk the stairs because the only things that can use the stairs are seeing eye dogs? And what if you can't read this sign? It just goes on and on and on. These are the little games one can play with language. So no matter how authoritarian the text, and there's a word for that, monologic, no matter how you try and batten down the meaning, you can use adverbial modifiers, you can use imperative, you can do all sorts of things, take out all metaphors and similes from your authoritarian text. No matter what you do, someone is going to be able to read it in a way that contradicts your intention. This is what Bakhtin was all about in his exploration of heteroglossia and whatever other terms he came up with. He loved the notion of carnival and how there is a carnival in language where it doesn't matter what you try and do, language will spin off. You can't control it. It's untamable. And that, by the way, is why he didn't publish anything, because he knew that if he did, he would be imprisoned or shot in Stalin's Russia. Now, okay, so what does that all mean in terms of subject identity? Let's play a game here. Let's imagine a signifier Ian. Okay, now you have a signified right now. And the signified is presumably instructor. Okay, now you have that differential line, and the binary opposite is going to be not instructor. So, not your friend, not your relative, well, not unfriendly, but you know what I mean. Not your peer, not your father. Okay. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. Now, let's imagine that you go out on Friday night, go to a nightclub, and you see Ian behaving very badly. Ian's getting drunk, Ian's groping people, throwing up on the floor. It's appalling. And you go into school on Monday and you talk to the friends around you. You say, can you believe this shit? Can you believe this idiot? And you see, now the signified's different. It's Ian is idiot, wanker, dolt, stupid, fool. Differential, the opposite of that. Or Ian is now disrespected instructor, differential, as against all those who you still continue to respect. But now let's imagine that somebody overhears you, or one of your friends overhears you, and they think differently. They kind of like this story. So Ian signifier equals signified, right on, cool dude instructor, differential, as against all those boring ordinary instructors, right? And now other people pick up the story and they have all their different signifieds. And then I walk into the classroom. Can you imagine the atmosphere, the weird faces looking at me? And I'm just thinking, what is going on here, right? Now, perhaps I'm thinking that because I wasn't at the nightclub. It wasn't me. So it would have been some kind of doppelganger or look-alike that you saw or someone saw. Or maybe it's just you being mischievous or someone being mischievous and creating a story. But you can see how the signifying chain is buzzing, right? I mean, we saw this in travesties, we saw a bit of it in The Importance of Being Earnest, that the intention is spinning off in the wrong, well, it's just ignored because the words are spinning off in all sorts of different directions here. And I guess the more important point, putting that little story aside, is that I can do whatever the hell I want to try to get you to see me in a certain way. I can dress as I'm very boring. You can see how boringly I dress, right? I'm sure you have other instructors who wear wonderful things in front of the camera. I talk to you a certain way. I want you to perceive me in a certain way, but I really don't know, do I? Particularly in this situation, I'm just staring into a little green light at the top of the computer here. I don't know, you could be sitting there thinking this is just another wanker mansplaining, Eurosplaining, cultural splaining, white splaining. I don't know, you know. That perhaps is the frightening dimension of identity politics when things are taken to that extreme, because then you end up with no conversation, no discourse or interaction at all. But it's sometimes a bit terrifying, you know, because you interact with your friends, you want your friends and your peer group to think about you and look at you in a certain way. You're continually trying to corral that perception that's signified, but ultimately you don't know what's being said behind your back, and you don't know what's being said in, you know, you don't know what the signifieds are, right? So scary, but also fun. Let's think of an abstract noun signifier now, which is more sort of pertinent and apposite to our course, which would be time. Now, this obviously goes to memory. And I've already sort of teased away a little bit at the problem of time in the previous video, but we can have a signified quite simply a clock face or a watch, and we think of clock time in that sense conventionally. Chronology, yes. And so there's the differential. The binary opposite is going to be timeless, or it might be other constructions of time that don't conform to the clock and chronology. And that's the problem, really, because the more you kind of dig down on these signifieds of the signifier time, the more difficult, the more metaphoric it becomes, and the more difficult it becomes for us to find a signified that we can sort of coalesce around and agree upon. St. Augustine of Hippo, often referred to from that place in Africa, who died, I think, 430-ish AD, had a notion of time that was, he used the metaphor of stream, water in a stream flowing, which, you know, is nice, isn't it? But raises all sorts of questions. So if that's the case, then what constitutes the banks, the river banks, or the banks of the stream? What is it flowing on? And at what speed? And what causes it? So it really doesn't get us very far, you know. We could perhaps try a cyclical notion of time. And this is when we might be thinking about the seasons. And just think of how fundamentally they seem to inform our moods, our perceptions, our artistic creations. But then you think about people living in, I don't know, Bogota, Colombia. This is bizarre. I spent some time in Bogota, and they don't have seasons. They really don't. Or if they do, they have it all on the same day, every day. So you wake up in the morning. The mornings are lovely, actually, because they're sort of bright and sunny and quite warm. And then as you sort of go into the afternoon, the clouds arrive and they build up, and then you nearly always get some type of precipitation in the evening, and it can be icy or not. And then just, you know, re-rinse, just go every day. It's like that. It's quite bizarre. But I think for them, notions of seasons are problematic. All right, so what else can we do? We can think about calendar time and set our time to the solar system. But even then, of course, we've got all sorts of problems. We operate according to the Gregorian calendar. I think Christians established Easter in terms of the Julian calendar. I think that's right. My wife is Russian. She celebrates Christmas on the 7th of January because of an Orthodox calendar. So bloody hell, right? I mean, calendar's difficult. Mechanical clocks, right? These are great. And we talked about this last time. But what do you set the clock to? And so we have that extraordinary situation with the timetables I took you to in the last video, with the station masters setting their clock to, different times across England and elsewhere, of course. We could try the second law of thermodynamics, and that gives us a very interesting notion of time, which is irreversible. So you've got, in my believe me, very basic understanding, you've got a beaker of, nitrogen and oxygen molecules with a separator, right? So nitrogen here, oxygen here, and then you take the separator away, these molecules are going to mix, and it's irreversible. It's not like you can, separate them, out again. And not only are they going to mix, they're going to mix in more and more and more. And so we have this notion of entropy. Yeah, all right, okay, so we can play with that, but you can see that we have so many different, sort of, not contradictory, but different notions of time. The Greeks had 3 words for time. Chronos is the one we're familiar with, which is, gives us chronological time. Kairos, which was opportune, at the right time, and prepon, which is appropriate, at the appropriate time. This, again, is something I do with my English 100 students, sort of getting them to think about marketing, because when you're marketing a product, you need to be thinking about Kairos and prepon in terms of product placement. You don't want to put your, beer advert into episodes of SpongeBob, right? Because it's not Kairos and it's not prepon. So you need to be aware of these different notions of time. For deconstructionists like Derrida, it seems at times as though he's almost like a textual terrorist, because he's just deliberately trying to break authorial intentions and show how you can take a text and read it in so many myriad ways as to resist any kind of overarching interpretation or meaning. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be fun to do too. And to a certain extent, of course, many people will say, well, this is all very well, but we have to live, don't we? And so we do have to kind of congregate around certain metaphors and just live with them. And this is Nietzsche, basically. I mean, everything I've been talking about is coming from Nietzsche. Bakhtin, Wittgenstein, they're coming from Nietzsche. And so we'll have GMT, because why the hell not? We need it, in order to live and run with our lives in a practical way. This notion of time, these different notions of time, this problem of time is germane, of course, to our topic of memory, because it's actually really bloody difficult to think about memory without hooking it up to some notion of time. But the more we recognize that time and memory live in language, just as we live in language, and the more we recognize the instability of the signifying chain, the more difficult it becomes to just talk about memory as, amygdala or hippocampal. It seems too restrictive, don't you think? At least from a postmodern perspective, it's going to be too restrictive. And that's what I mean by we're now looking at memory and thinking about it beyond the limbic system, where we started from. For Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentinian writer who died, I think, in the mid-1980s, memory lives in the instability of language, in the sort of instability of the signifying chain. And the metaphor, well, one of them, but the key metaphor that repeats in his fiction to sort of suggest this complexity and instability is the labyrinth, the maze. Let me just quote something from a little essay he wrote called The Nothingness of Personality, which came out in 1922. He says that memory is no more than the noun by which we imply that among the innumerable possible states of consciousness, many occur again in an imprecise way. The whole self does not exist. So in that sense, memory can't really be a storage place in the way that we've been thinking about, Tulving, for example. It's chaotic, it's random. I mean, this, of course, connects us or flows from the surrealism that we were talking about in the previous video. And it has about it the tortuous, difficult, and confusing properties of labyrinth. And let's, of course, hook this up to the creator, the mythical creator of the labyrinth, who was Daedalus, right? He created the labyrinth of the Minotaur, this half bull or beast, half man creature. Well, it's described in so many different ways, and the story comes to us in so many different iterations, but it's basically consuming virgins or boys or a mix of both of them. And of course, these have to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. And it's Theseus who bravely goes into the labyrinth created by Daedalus. So he speaks to Daedalus, finds out about the labyrinth, connects with Ariadne, who gives him a ball of string. You know the story, right? And he goes into the labyrinth and he kills the Minotaur, and then he gets out using the string. This is referred to in the Iliad by Homer. I think I've got a picture of it somewhere here. There we are. I mean, this is just an imagination of the Minotaur's labyrinth, which I thought was pretty cool. Here is the man himself. And this is a labyrinth called the Borges Labyrinth in Venice. I think labyrinths in Borges' stories suggest the complexities of memory. I mean, not just textually, but also sort of topographically. When I look at mazes and labyrinths, I don't know about you, but I immediately think of the brain. It's almost as though you're seeing these kind of engrams or furrows. I'm going to take you now to a labyrinth from the Cathedral of Chartres, just outside Paris. The labyrinth here is unicursal, so you have one entrance and you kind of follow it, and eventually you get to a center. And this is, we think it was created in the 13th century, early 13th century. And it's kind of what you see when you first arrive at the church. So you go through the door, and the pilgrims would force themselves to go through this labyrinth and get through it before they would then go towards the altar at the far end. and they would do this perhaps on their bare knees. So these people are just being lazy. And here's another picture of it. So what we now need to do is read The Garden of Forking Paths. So if you haven't done so already, read it now. I'm just going to pause the video for a second while I find it. Okay, so here is the story. One of the things we should understand about a physical labyrinth of the like I have shown you is that it has clear boundaries, right? It has walls like a hedge just around you, or you can see a clear boundary on the floor, right? In the stone or whatever. So, but you don't have that in a text. So with textual labyrinth, which is what we have here, it's difficult to realize what track you're on. And it's also difficult to understand whether there is a center, let alone whether you've reached it. So this gives us, I think, by this I mean textual labyrinth, gives us, I think, two feelings. The first is the sense that we're continually missing things. We're not quite sure of what we're reading or why. Why, yeah. It's just radical instability, right? So there's that sense. And often we find ourselves having to reread in order to try and make sense of the rest of the story. And the second feeling is very often of a text inside a text inside a text inside a text. It's this kind of layering. It's profoundly intertextual in that sense. And I talked about intertextuality in the previous video. And that's very much what we've got here. I mean, we have a story. Okay, it's written by a writer called Borges. But straight away, it pitches us into another text. And what we find with each of these other texts is that there are problems. Problems of meaning and significance in each text. So the first one we're taken to is this book about the First World War by Basil Littleheart. And the problem with that, I'll come to in a moment. Then we have another text, which is this statement dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Yu Sin. But here's the problem. The first 2 pages are missing. Then we have the beginning of the statement, Yu Sin statement here, third paragraph, with the ellipsis of things cut or cut out or missing. And we've got a quotation here, right? See these quotation marks? Well, the problem is that they disappear. You go to the very end, there are no quotation marks here. And yet it still seems to be the same narrator. So where does this end, this quotation? So you see, we have another text which, you know, just leaves us hanging. We have this number 1 here, which is a footnote. And then when we go to the footnote, here it is. It's an editor's note. But who the hell is an editor? Is the editor here? Is it Borges? Doesn't feel as though it is, because the editor here seems British, because the editor is basically defending the British captain Richard Madden, saying that the killing of Runeberg, the German agent, was self-defense. It wasn't murder. So you know, it's a bit odd who that narrator is and where they're coming from and what that does to the status of this overall text. It seems to pitch it from story into some kind of document. And you know, and I've only just started because we have on the second page reference here to, oh bollocks, what did I just do there? It's made it bigger, didn't I? We have reference to a letter which is incomplete. Here we are. I resolved to destroy it immediately, and which I did not destroy. But then why? Why didn't he destroy it? So that seems a bit odd. We have a lost encyclopedia, which isn't lost. We have a reference to an 18th century Chinese novel called the Honglu Meng, but that seems to conflate into a novel written by the great-great-grandfather of Yu Sun, who was Su Pen. We also have a fragmented letter from Su Pen, and of course we have Su Pen's Labyrinth. So, bloody hell, I mean, it is difficult, just in terms of the interlacing texts of this labyrinthine story. And now just on this beginning, we have a reference to Little Hart's History of World War I. So we have an attack against the Serra Montauban line by 13 British divisions, supported by 1,400 artillery pieces, planned for the 24th of July 1916, which had to be postponed until the morning of the 29th. The torrential rains, Captain Little Hart comments, caused this delay, an insignificant one to be sure. But when you actually get hold of this book by Little Hart, which exists, on page 240, he refers to this incident, but the dates are wrong. And not only are the dates wrong, but Little Hart comments that this delay was actually really significant, not an insignificant one. It was really significant because of the difficulty it created in moving the artillery pieces in the mud, and because of the increased stress experienced by the soldiers. So, labyrinthine, it turns out that we have been misdirected here, presumably by Bourges, without our even knowing it. And it's only by going back and retracing our steps that we discover that we've been misled. Right? So the story begins in this way, with confusing interlacing of texts, with confusing subject identity. We have a Chinese man, Dr. Yu Sun, but a professor of English in Germany. But he's not in Germany now, he's in England, but it seems as though he's spying for the Germans, as was Victor Runeberg. And having killed Runeberg in whatever circumstances, because that's unclear, Madden is now chasing Yu Sun, and we find out as we go through this paragraph on the first page that Yu Sun has got a problem. What he's got to do is tell his boss in Berlin of the exact location of the new British artillery park on the River Anker. How does he do that? Remember, this is the First World War, right? Not easy. So there's the challenge, and there is the chase, and the journey commences. But we've got a weird sense of time in this story, because just as we have this chase, you know, Yu Sun gets to the station, he gets on the train, and he sees Madden on the platform, just missed the train, which means there's 40 minutes he's got spare. Just as there is this sense of urgency and rush, we then have Yu Sun sitting down with Stephen Albert, just relaxed and talking philosophy. So the sense of time is of no time at all and all the time in the world. And of course, this is a deliberate confusion of how time is operating in this story. The signifier of spy is also problematized. I say spy to you, you have a signified, okay? But it turns out that in this story, it's not so simple because Yu Sun doesn't want to be a spy. And he has, it seems, really nothing but contempt for his boss and for his master. Look at this. Yeah, here on this page, second paragraph. I'm a cowardly man. I say it now that I've carried to its end a plan whose perilous nature no one can deny. I didn't do it for Germany. No, I care nothing for a barbarous country which imposed upon me the abjection of being a spy. Plus, I know a guy from England. He's nice, modest man, no less great than Goethe. So why is he doing what he's doing? I did it because I sensed that the chief somehow feared people of my race, for the innumerable ancestors who merge within me. Okay, it's a kind of odd motive, a motive which is not clearly signified, especially bearing in mind the extent to which he is prepared to follow through with it to death. And whilst one could imagine him having that motive vis-a-vis the German Empire, why not the British Empire too? So it's odd, isn't it, in terms of why he's doing what he's doing. All right, so we have this journey, this chase, and on the next page, we have a clear allusion to a labyrinth here. So he gets out of the train and somebody says, well, the house, or Stephen Albert's house, is a long way from here, but you won't get lost if you take this road to the left, and at every crossroads turn again to your left. And a few lines down he says, the instructions to turn always to the left reminded me that such was the common procedure for discovering the central point of certain labyrinths. And then he talks to us about his understanding of labyrinths as the great grandson of that Sui Pen, who was governor of Yunnan, and who renounced worldly power in order to write a novel that might be even more populous than the Hu Long Meng. This, as I said, is an 18th century Chinese novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber, the authorship provenance of which is, again, completely up in the air. There is a writer, Zhao Yuxian, but he actually denies authorship. The novel comes to us as 80 chapters, but then there are an additional 40 chapters that seem to have been added by editors. So there's that confusion, and then there's actually what happens inside the chapters of the novel. So you have a character who is hanged in one chapter and dies, but the same character reappears later and dies in bed of a mysterious illness. You have a hero in chapter 3 who dies, who's then alive and well in chapter 4. So you get these kind of confusions inside that novel. And as we'll see in a moment, it looks as though that novel may actually have been written by Sui Pen. Okay. We have then the meeting, having worked his way through the Garden of Forking Paths. Yusen actually meets Stephen Elbert, and who is a sinologist, an expert in Chinese culture, and thought. Here he is, I think this is about halfway down, third of the way down. Stephen Elbert observed me with a smile. He was, as I've said, very tall. He told me that he'd been a missionary in Zenzin, before aspiring to become a sinologist. Now, Albert says, an astounding fate, that of your great-great-grandfather Sui Pen. He abandoned all of what he had in order to compose a book and a maze. He renounced the pleasures of both tyranny and justice, of his populous couch, of his banquets, all to close himself up for 13 years in the pavilion of the limpid solitude. And when he died, his heirs found nothing save chaotic manuscripts. His family, as you may be aware, wished to condemn them to the fire, but his executor, a Taoist or Buddhist monk, insisted on their publication. Well, we descendants of Sui Pen, I replied, continued to curse that monk. Their publication was senseless. The book is an indeterminate heap of contradictory drafts. I examined it once. In the 3rd chapter, the hero dies. In the 4th, he's alive. But that is the Hongyu Men. So that's what I mean about two texts conflating here. This is the radical textual instability and intertextuality of this text. Here is Sui Pen's labyrinth, he said, indicating a tall lacquered desk. An ivory labyrinth. A labyrinth of symbols, he corrected. An invisible labyrinth of time. To me, a barbarous Englishman has been entrusted the revelation of this diaphanous mystery. Sui Pen must have said once, I am withdrawing to write a book. And another time, I'm withdrawing to construct a labyrinth. Everyone imagined two works. To no one did it occur that the book and the maze were one and the same thing. We then have a reference to this fragment of a letter, which Albert has discovered. He passes it to Yutsen, and he reads, I leave to the various futures, not to all my garden of forking paths. And then we have, I think, an important paragraph here, quite revealing one. Before unearthing this letter, says Albert, I questioned myself about the ways in which a book can be infinite. I could think of nothing other than a cyclic volume, a circular one, a book whose last page was identical with the first, a book which had the possibility of continuing indefinitely. Well, that's suggested in this story by the absence of the quotation marks, right, at the end. So we have a reference to 1001 Nights when Scheherazade begins to relate word for word the story of the 1001 Nights, establishing the risk of coming once again to the night when she must repeat it, and thus on to infinity. I imagine as well a Platonic, hereditary work, transmitted from father to son, and so on. These conjectures diverted me, but none seem to correspond, even remotely, to the contradictory chapters of Sui Pen. And then I received this little manuscript. We have the reference in italics, and almost instantly I understood, says Albert. The Garden of Forking Paths was the chaotic novel. The phrase, the various futures, not to all, suggested to me the forking in time, not in space. A broad rereading of the work confirmed the theory. In all fictional works, each time a man is confronted with several alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the others. In the fiction of Sui Pen, he chooses simultaneously all of them. This is amazing. I think it's brilliant. He creates in this way diverse futures, diverse times which themselves also proliferate and fork. Here then is the explanation of the novel's contradictions. Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger calls at the door. Fang resolves to kill him. Naturally, there are several possible outcomes. Just bear with me a second, sorry. Okay, and in one iterational version of this video, my son comes and tells me I need to... anyway. All possible outcomes can occur. Each one is the point of departure for other forkings. So sometimes the paths of this labyrinth converge. For example, you arrive at this house, but in one of the possible paths, you are my enemy, in another, my friend. So now, this takes us towards what he's saying about time here. I think I need to answer this. I'm losing control of this video. Right, so we move towards the end of the story. And this particular passage here, I think it gets even more interesting. He says, philosophic controversy usurps a good part of the novel. I know that of all problems, none disturbed him so greatly, nor worked upon him so much, as the abysmal problem of time. That's why I looked at time earlier in this video. Now, then, the latter is the only problem that does not figure in the pages of the garden. He does not even use the word that signifies time. How do you explain this voluntary omission? I proposed several solutions, all unsatisfactory. We discussed them. Finally, Stephen Albert said to me, in a riddle whose answer is chess, what is the only prohibited word? I thought a moment and replied, the word chess. Precisely, said Albert. The Garden of Forking Paths is an enormous riddle, or parable, whose theme is time. This recondite cause, obscure, difficult cause, prohibits its mention. To omit a word always, to resort to inept metaphors and obvious paraphrases, is perhaps the most emphatic way of stressing it. That is the tortuous method preferred in each of the meanderings of his indefatigable novel by the oblique sweep pen. I've compared hundreds of manuscripts. I've corrected the errors that the negligence of the copyist has introduced. I've guessed the plan of this chaos. I've re-established, I believe I have re-established the primordial organization. I've translated the entire work. It's clear to me that not once does he employ the word time. The explanation's obvious. The Garden of Forking Paths is an incomplete but not false image of the universe, as Sweep Pen conceived it. In contrast to Newton and Schopenhauer, your ancestor did not believe in a uniform absolute time. He believed in an infinite series of times, in a growing, dizzying net of divergent, convergent, and parallel times. This network of times which approached one another, forked, broke off, or were unaware of one another for centuries, embraces all possibilities of time. We do not exist in the majority of these times. In some you exist, and not I. In others I, and not you. In others both of us. In the present one, which a favourable fate has granted me, you have arrived at my house. In another, while crossing the garden, you found me dead. In still another, I utter these same words, but I'm a mistake, a ghost. And then we come to the end of the story here. So Albert rose, opens a drawer. For the moment, his back was to me. I'd readied the revolver. I fired with extreme caution. And he fell uncomplainingly and immediately. And the rest is real insignificant, I suppose, in that sense, because it's just one version of what happened. So I've been condemned to the gallows. I've won out abominably. I've communicated to Berlin the secret name of the city they must attack. This is the clever language game that Borges has been playing here. So they bombed it yesterday. I read in the same papers that offered to England the mystery of the learned sinologist Stephen Albert, who was murdered by a stranger, one Usam. The chief had deciphered this mystery. He knew my problem was to indicate, through the uproar of the war, the city called Albert, and that I had found no other means to do so than to kill a man of that name. He does not know, no one can know, my innumerable contrition and weariness. I suppose weariness because this story never ends. There's just going to be another iteration, which is why there is no quotation mark at the end. There is no ending. And I think what this story does for us is show us an example of the radical instability of subject identity on this symbolic or signifying chain. Because after all, we have a person here, Stephen Albert, who is killed simply because, and only because, of what his name signifies to someone else. A signified does for him, quite literally, or at least it does so in this version of the story. Okay. A few words about the midterm. I'm not actually planning on doing a video for the next class. I think in the outline it says a reading review session or something. What I think I might do is just scribble down some notes and send them across to you, which might help organize your thoughts. So in the midterm, you're going to be asked to write 2 short essays. In the first, you will be asked to explore how James Joyce uses memory in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So you're going to have to write on that novel, whether you like it or not, I'm afraid. That's the first essay you'll have to write. The second essay can be a choice. So I'll give you 2 or 3 different questions and you can just choose one that suits you. One of them will be asking you to distinguish different treatments of memory by romanticists, symbolists, and surrealists. Another essay question will be asking you to look at the treatment of memory in The Importance of Being Earnest and travesties. And then I think I'll give you another question, if you want, on maybe contrasting Proust and Borges and how these 2 writers treat memory. But it will only be one of those. Okay, so in total, you will only write 2 1,000-word essays. And you're going to have plenty of time to do it, several days in which to do it. And to now repeat what I said in the first video in terms of my expectations, well, I suppose in a first-year literature course at university, we want a grammatically correct, well-organized essay. That would be good. So hopefully we're going to have that. And if you do that and just regurgitate what I've done in these videos, using my examples, quotes, whatever, that's fine. That's going to be absolutely fine. And you will get a decent grade, B, B+, something like that, if you do it well. So it's that easy. It's just a question of trawling through the videos and just lifting some of the quotes that I've used and organizing it as you wish. And then again, as I've said before, if you want better grades than that, this is the point at which you're going to have to start going a bit beyond what I've said in the videos by doing a bit of research, which could be on one aspect of memory, neuroscience that we've touched on in these videos. It could be other examples in Joyce's novel, for example, not the ones I use, but ones that you found, perhaps taking me into chapter 5, which of course you don't have to do. But this is how you will start to impress me and get yourself into these upper grades. And if you are doing that and you're going to use some academic research, then you should be using MLA format in this midterm, which you should be familiar with because you should have done it in English 100. So, at the risk of repeating myself yet again, you don't have to do that, right? You really don't have to do that. But you do need to be doing something like that if you want to score that A+. So I'm now going to leave that with you. We'll get through the midterm, and then we'll move into something completely different, but also the same, which is going to take us into the world of photography and the photograph as a memory device. Good. All right. Sorry about the interruptions today in this video. I'll try to avoid that in the future, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.